What if the very words we use to define global events could spark a geopolitical tussle? The G20, a group of the world's largest economies, finds itself in the midst of such a debate. This group, consisting of 19 countries and the European Union, has a significant influence on global policy and economic stability. It's a platform where nations discuss, negotiate, and make critical decisions that impact our world. Currently, the G20 is grappling with a contentious issue: how to refer to the ongoing situation in Ukraine. What might seem like a semantic debate to some holds profound implications in the realm of international relations. The choice of words can shape perceptions, drive narratives, and even influence policy decisions. India, currently holding the G20 presidency, has attempted to persuade the member nations to refer to the situation in Ukraine as a crisis or a challenge rather than a war. This move aligns not only with Russia's preference but also mirrors China's stance. Both nations, key players in the global political arena, have refrained from using the term war, instead opting for less aggressive terminology. This linguistic shift is notable, especially when we consider the G20's previous declaration in November 2022. The change in rhetoric marks a departure from the group's earlier stance and raises interesting questions about the dynamics within the G20. The words we choose in international relations can be as powerful as any action. But what led to this linguistic tug-of-war, and what does it mean for the global political climate? Words carry weight in global politics. The choice between war and crisis is more than just semantics. It's a strategic decision with far-reaching implications. Let's delve a little deeper into this. To the untrained eye, war and crisis might seem interchangeable, but in the realm of international relations, they're worlds apart. A war is generally understood as an active, open conflict between two or more nations. It's a term that carries the weight of international law and can trigger certain actions and responses from the global community. On the other hand, a crisis is a more nebulous term. It suggests a difficult or dangerous situation, but without the explicit military connotation. Labeling a situation as a crisis rather than a war can soften its perception and potentially downplay the severity of the situation. Now let's take a look at the India-Russia connection. India's economic ties with Russia are significant. The country has been a major importer of Russian oil and natural gas, and has resisted the call to impose sanctions on Russia. This economic relationship could be a factor in India's reluctance to label the situation in Ukraine as a war. But it's not just about economics. The language we use to describe international events also shapes public perception. By choosing to call it a crisis, India, along with Russia and China, may be attempting to control the narrative and influence the global understanding of the situation. It's a delicate balancing act, and it's not without risk. The choice of language can signal a nation's stance, hint at its alliances, and influence its global image. This is why the world is watching closely, to see how the choice of words will shape the course of events. The choice of language is strategic, with implications for alliances, economies, and global perceptions. So, what has been the reaction to India's proposition? The G20's hesitation to label the Ukraine situation as a war has not gone unnoticed. Reactions have been varied. Some nations like India and China prefer to refer to the conflict as a crisis or a challenge. This choice of language is not accidental. It's a subtle way of aligning with Russia's preference and avoiding the political implications of the term war. The ripple effects of this linguistic choice are already being felt on the international stage. Countries that have traditionally been allies find themselves on opposing sides of the debate. This has led to a re-evaluation of alliances and power dynamics within the G20. The reluctance of some nations to use the term war signals a shift in the geopolitical landscape. It suggests a realignment of alliances, with some countries seemingly more inclined to side with Russia. This could potentially result in a change in the balance of power within the G20 and beyond. But what does this mean for the future? Well, if the current trend continues, we might see a reconfiguration of global power structures. Nations may have to rethink their strategies and alliances in a world where the lines between war and crisis are blurred. The increased import of Russian oil and natural gas by India, despite the ongoing conflict, hints at a potential economic realignment as well. This move might prompt other nations to reconsider their economic ties and dependencies. However, it's important to remember that these are uncertain times. Predicting the exact outcome of these shifts is akin to reading tea leaves at the bottom of a cup. What we do know is that the actions and words of the G20 countries are creating ripples that extend beyond the immediate crisis in Ukraine. The world is watching closely, and the stakes are high. The diplomatic language used today could very well set the tone for international relations in the years to come. As we navigate these uncertain times, the actions and words of the G20 countries will continue to shape our global future. The stakes are high, and the world watches on. In the world of international relations, every word matters. And the G20's linguistic dance around the Ukraine situation is no exception. We've delved into the significance of the G20, a formidable force in global politics, and the power it holds in shaping international narratives. The choice of language, as we've seen, is far from trivial. The debate over whether to label the situation in Ukraine as a war, crisis, or challenge reveals the intricate game of diplomacy that's at play. We've also touched upon the varied global reactions and the potential implications of this linguistic tussle. It's interesting to see how nations like India, Russia, and China, each with their own vested interests, are navigating this space. This narrative formed by words can influence alliances, shape perceptions, and ultimately steer the course of global events. As we close, remember this: the language of diplomacy is a language of power. It shapes perceptions, alliances, and ultimately, the course of global events. So, keep an eye on the words as much as the actions, for they hold the keys to understanding